Well, as most of you know, I'm Julie Mead, Professor and Chair of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis, which means it's my distinct privilege and honor to welcome you all to the School of Education celebration of American Education Week. And I think it's only fitting that we begin our week celebration with a focus on educational leadership. In particular, today we honor the extraordinary contributions of our three most recent retirees from the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis: Paul Bredeson, Alan Phelps, and Alan Knox. Speaking first today is Paul Bredeson. Paul joined the faculty of the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis in 1991. During his 20 years on our faculty, he has taught courses in professional development and organizational learning, instructional leadership and school improvement, and research methods. He also served as department chair from 2004 to May 2010 and talked me into doing this.
That's leadership.
For that, he will never be forgiven, by the way. No, I'm just kidding. Nationally, Paul has served as president of the National Council of Professors of Educational Administration, president of the University Council for Educational Administration, and is a member of the National Policy Board for Educational Administration, and is a technical advisor to the Interstate School Leaders Licensure Consortium for the development and assessment of national standards for school leaders. He is widely known both nationally and internationally and has lectured in Canada, Russia, Sweden, Norway, Australia, Belarus, China, Taiwan, South Africa, and Brazil. In fact, he is an international faculty associate at Umeå University in Sweden and was recently awarded an honorary doctoral degree there. And I must say the pictures of him in tails are just fabulous, so you need to see those. Over the past 28 years, Paul's research is centered on alternative conceptions of leadership, especially in regard to school principals. Paul's work, both theoretical and empirical, examines the role of school leaders in the design, delivery, and assessment of outcomes of professional development that builds organizational capacity to enhance student learning and equity in schools. He is author of two major books: The Principalship, A Theory of Professional Learning and Practice, and Designs for Learning, A New Architecture for Professional Development in Schools. His latest book and the other as well are used in graduate educational leadership and policy programs across the United States, Canada, Australia, Russia, Sweden, and Hong Kong. Paul has also been co-principal investigator for an urban high school leadership project, Leadership for Learning, funded by the Wallace Foundation. His work in 6 urban high schools is focused on the ways in which principals and teachers work together on instructional leadership teams to influence practices that enhance student learning outcomes, especially for traditionally marginalized students at school, department, and classroom levels. Today, as you can see, Paul will share with us his work in a presentation entitled Breaking the Box, A New Architecture for Leadership and Learning. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Professor Paul Bredeson.
Thank you very much, Julie, for that generous introduction. And I want to thank each of you for spending a little time with me this afternoon. It's really a distinct pleasure, and I've got to say right at the outset, this is not a Randy Pausch last lecture. I intend to keep giving these things, you know. I just can't help myself. So I hope you're not disappointed. And it's really, for me, a distinct pleasure to have been a part of this terrific faculty. I mean, when you think about being in the #1 or #2, I mean, who's going to quibble about these numbers, program in educational leadership, and we have been for decades, and the top college or school of education in the nation, and always up in the top ranks, and at a world-class university, who's been more privileged than me to be a part of that? And I hope in some small way that I've been able to make a contribution over time to that. You know, I need to share with you, my grandparents farmed about 18 miles from here, down by a small little burg called Mount Vernon. And I used to play basketball up in the haymow with my cousin. And since I was a flatlander, my parents moved to Rockford, Illinois, I always wanted to be a Badger. And so he would have to be some other team, and I was going to play for the Badgers. That was now that was probably about 55 years ago. And I had no idea at that time when I was shooting buckets, at a hoop with a gunny sack around it, that it would all come to this. But again, I've been extraordinarily lucky to be a part of this faculty. And part of that luck, though, that for graduate students, for people who don't know, is part of being a part of a faculty like this, it makes you better. It helps you with your ideas. It helps you in all sorts of ways as a person. And so really, I'm the one who's been blessed over this time. And of course, I want to give a nod not only to my colleagues on the faculty, but the extraordinary graduate students that come here and work with us, and how we learn from them, and what a joy it is to continue that work. Let's see if I can work with this. There we go. What I'd like to do today is use an extended metaphor, if you will, on architecture that I used in my book, Designs for Learning. And I want to talk about the metaphor of breaking up the box. And so we're going to do that. And I'm going to describe 3 boxes that I would identify. And then I'm going to talk about, well, how might we think in different ways? How might we reimagine space? Because if the primary illusion of architecture is the creation of space, how might we rethink that? And to do that, there'll be some visual images that we can follow. But more important, I want to speak to the research project that Julie talked about in the introduction, and that is the Wallace Leadership Project that I worked with Carolyn Kelly. Speaking of terrific colleagues to work with, and we did the Wallace Leadership Project in 6 urban high schools, and I'm going to take a piece, or my slice of that, and talk in particular about professional development for the transformation of school department heads into distributed instructional leaders. So those are the pieces that I'm going to weave together this afternoon in my lecture. Now, I want you to take a look at this image because it is going to help me illustrate the metaphor of breaking the box. Now, this is what we call a painted lady, I guess in San Francisco or even here in Madison. But it's the kind of thing that I refer to in the Designs for Learning that Frank Lloyd Wright really railed against. Oh, by the way, Frank Lloyd Wright, he's a student here in 1890. Just think of what he could have become if he just stayed and just worked with us a little bit longer. But at any rate, when we look at this particular image, as an architect, he was greatly offended by this. And in fact, let's see what he said. That particular house, the Victorian house, lied about everything. It had no sense of unity at all, nor any such a sense of space as should belong to a free people. Okay? Look at that. Shouldn't, okay? It began somewhere way down in the wet and ended up as high as it could get in the high and the narrow. The house was a bedeviled box with a fussy lid, a complex box that had to be cut up by all kinds of holes and made into it to let in the light and air, and with an especially ugly hole to go in and out of. So that's that. Okay? That's what he thought about that house. That was the dominant style, if you can think about that, in the late 19th century, in the 20th century. Okay? Well, so I began thinking about that particular quote when I was visiting Taliesin once, and I thought, gosh, that seems particularly appropriate also in my own field, kind of a bedeviled box, sometimes with fussy lids on it, sometimes really constraining us, and not really having the potential that we would all like to have. Now, so he talked about breaking up. Frank Lloyd Wright talked about breaking up this box, whether it be just a cubicle, but the whole idea to imagine space just as a rectangle, or just, and getting out of that. How could we rethink it? Well, here's one way that he rethought it. Now, this is a house that I drive by very often on my way home. It's just off Old Sauk Road. In fact, it's got so many trees around it now, you can't even see it. But in the message here of reimagining space was reimagining, okay, exactly what the relationship should be to living and the outdoors as should belong to a free people. So this particular place, it's open and free, as you can see. And imagine how revolutionary this was. Of course, people thought he was crazy. Because when you put that Victorian house up against something like this, and remember, a lot of these were experimental designs, it was actually really quite revolutionary. The whole idea that it's of the land and not on the land, where the Victorian house has to sit there, right? It reminds me kind of, as I used in my book, I said it's kind of like on these little lots that they often sit on in urban areas. They're kind of like a guy in his 50s trying to squeeze into his 34-size jeans. I mean, they're way too big. You spill over, you know, it's pretty gaudy and ugly. But the point here is it had a number of principles also. This horizontality, but basically using some very familiar materials, but using them in a very, very different way, and welcoming in and cutting down the limitations, the difference between the outside and the inside, and minimizing those. But more important, remember that these were design experiments. These were not necessarily meant to be around forever. We're the preservationists, remember? And so we're the ones that are keeping these things in kind of frozen in time. But he was always thinking, Frank Lloyd Wright was always thinking, that this is going to help us think in new ways about breaking up that traditional box with the ugly place to go in and out of, and make us think about new products and new processes. Another one of his that I'm sure you'll recognize is Falling Water. If you haven't been there, please go. It's one of the most extraordinary places on earth. Now, one of the things I want to say about that and about the metaphor and how it applies to leadership, believe me, I'm going to get to it, is that these were design experiments and everything wasn't perfect. He wanted to try things. And so I love the story behind this house, that he built this for Kaufman, who was a wealthy merchant in Pittsburgh. And so Kaufman called him up after this house, Falling Water, had been built. And he said, Frank, I'm sitting in my living room, and there's water dripping on my head. And Frank, in his own wonderful Badger style, said, move your chair. Now, the point of that story is really, he didn't have all of the materials. He didn't have all of the ideas about what it would take to have a building like this, completely leak-proof, to have windows that came out and were cantilevered and that met with no support. I mean, remember the box? The box had to be built in a particular way, but he was experimenting constantly. So to me, what that suggests is as we experiment and think and reimagine space in educational leadership, what we're trying to do is we may not have everything perfectly right. We're going to try, we have purpose, we have principles, we have ideas. Some of them aren't going to work, but that doesn't bother me because we're trying new things and we're doing it to try to make things better. Now, the other thing I want you to look at this is that this has very familiar kind of shapes. It's not using really wild, radical shapes. It's just using very familiar things, but putting them in different ways. Now, there's another picture of Frank Lloyd Wright standing under the lowest cantilever there, right by the stream on that rock. And they had all the scaffolding up to hold it up because everyone said, this isn't going to work, it's going to collapse on you. He said, fine, tear it down, and it'll fall right on me, and that'll be the end of this, and we won't have to discuss it anymore. And of course, there's a wonderful picture of him standing under there and just saying, wait, okay, let's wait for it to collapse. And it's still standing, okay? So he was trying things that people said, you can't do it, it violates the norms, and he did all of those kinds of things. And he was challenging those existing norms. Now, let's think about the field of educational leadership. And I would argue that there are likely at least three boxes that we need to be thinking about in our field. One is the educational leadership box. And in this particular one, I'm going to go to the next slide, because I think it really speaks to this issue of limiting ourselves and being boxed in terms of our notion of leadership. That one person can make a difference and every person should try. So clearly I'm not arguing that individuals don't make a difference. Of course they do. But never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so the idea that leadership constrained or limited to the notion of one title, one position, one hierarchy or something like that really limits our thinking about what's possible and reimagining that space and getting it reconceptualized. Now, we've gone through all sorts of things in our field, right? I mean, about the great man theory, trait theory, behavioralist theory, situational leadership and contingency theories of leadership and all that. But most of that time, in all of that thinking, what happens is we may try to get outside that box, but most of the ideas have to come back into a very traditional box, very limited space. And so what I want to argue for is that in our research that we're doing with the Wallace Leadership Project, that leadership is not about individuals and positions and titles, that those things are important in organizational structures, but it really has more to do with organizational properties or capacity. And it's what Carolyn and I talk about in our work called distributed instructional leadership. And how then is this notion of leadership itself a notion of shared responsibility, shared commitment, shared vision, shared responsibility, all of those things. And so I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to refer to something that one of my colleagues in the audience, Chris, talked about. And why am I going to talk about this? Because of the urgency, magnitude, and complexity, thank you, Chris Hipp, that leadership is so critical in organizations and in society that the idea that any one person, now remember we're in urban high schools, so the idea of one leader being able to carry this off and doing all of this work, him or herself, really defies logic. And so what we're trying to think about is, so where is the leadership? How could it flourish? How could it blossom? And so we talk about this instructional leadership and distribute it at that. Now, one of the things that's happened, of course, where we are right now, is that the accountability movement has really greatly exacerbated this whole focus on principles. And in fact, right now, the federal government wants to look at leadership. Now, this is why I'm making this argument, is because if they think about leadership as just being a single person or a title, something like that, in a very traditional way, I think we're going to lose the momentum that we need to talk about, well, what things could possibly change the equation here. And so we need to think about not just the leader, but we want to think about relationships that are important, processes that are important, culture and moral purpose. All of those become part of expanding this leadership box. Now, I would also argue that sometimes we've thought about this learning and how it may constrain us. And in this particular one, I want to talk about, well, how are we often constrained about thinking? Well, let's take a look at one of my favorite quotes by Eric Hoffer. In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped for a world that no longer exists. Now, you know, there's a wonderful story from the medical school here, and one of my graduate students shared it with me. And the story goes like this. There was a professor of medicine who worked with interns and who worked with students wanting to become physicians. And traditionally what happens in those kinds of settings is the professor and the MD wears a rather long lab coat, often comes down to his or her knees, and so that's a way of distinguishing. That's the learned. But the interns and the students wear short coats, lab coats. They're white. Now, this one particular professor, again, breaking the rules and the norms, refused to wear the long coat. He put on the short coat. Now, his colleagues and the administration didn't like that because, you know, this was confusing people. They can't tell who is the doctor and who are the learners here. And he said, I'm keeping the short coat on. And of course, the moral to that story is we all have to continue to be in short coats wherever we are. We can't become the learned and therefore stop. We're constantly in short coats. We're reading, we're studying, we're doing research, we're interpreting that. All of that is part of this learning process. You probably know about this Beloit college study that they do every year. And it's called the Mindset List, and it's about lived experiences. And I just love it because, you know, I think about, well, if that's true for us too, about being learned and learning, what are the kind of mindsets that we need to think about in our field to prepare the people who are going to be working for the next 20 to 30 years, perhaps longer, as leaders in educational organizations? What do they have to know? Now, what did it say this year? Here are just a few items, and I love this. Students, freshmen, say, what Berlin Wall? Is that the one with all the artwork on it in Berlin? That one? They've never rolled down a car window. They don't know what that is. Well, Nelson Mandela has always been free and a force in South Africa. They're always texting, and then here it is. You can visualize it like one and other. I'm not very good at this kind of stuff, but if you text, you know what that is. And finally, virtual reality has always been available when the real thing failed. Now, this is a mindset. So if we think about the people who are coming to us, now they're not college freshmen, granted, but we have an extraordinary responsibility to think about what that mindset is. When our field is dominated by such things as change and uncertainty and globalization and the digital and virtual world, social media, online and distance education, and education as a privatized commodity, my goodness, that is a completely different mindset that they're bringing to us. And to think about what does that have to do with this box, if you will, about being learned, how learned we are, and about being continual learners. And so as we move toward the research that I want to talk about in a few minutes, I want to talk about what some of that learning is about and what some of that content might be. Well, I got to talk about one more box, though, before we get to that. And that's breaking up some of the methodological boxes. And of course, we've had these wars for a long time. You know, you can argue about epistemology, you can talk about methods, you can talk about ontology, you can talk about all that stuff. And those are all very good words for Scrabble. It certainly has enriched my game playing. But more important than that, when we think about methodological boxes, is thinking about the change in relationship between researcher and researched and what that should look like. Now, to me, it kind of looks like this. Is that, and this relates to the research that we were doing, which was in interventionist research, more like action research, and so it violated a lot of those norms, okay? And it's really hard to stay clean when you do this kind of research in school. For example, intervention and inquiry, we were very interested in the outcome here. And we were intervening in particular to help urban high schools develop these core leadership teams around, centrally focused around instructional leadership. So we weren't neutral. We weren't these, stand off the side and not care what the outcomes were. Each session we helped plan and we thought about it and we had to change course and all of that kind of stuff. All the time, of course, we had our critical questions of inquiry to go along with it. But it was a different relationship that we had. And our researcher effects, we certainly hope we had some effects on these particular schools. My goodness, we were going in there to intervene and to help and to plan and to carry out professional development and to evaluate and to share those findings. So we were deeply involved. The dirty hands and guilty knowledge is not mine. That comes from an earlier study about, you know, when you're out there doing things, you hear a lot of things and see a lot of things that really is not part of the research itself. And so the things you find out and what people say, it may be about the principal. I mean, who knows what they say about us when we leave. But it may be about the principal, the associate principal, the department head, and all these kinds of things. So you have a lot of things that you get involved in. And sometimes it's not the nicest kind of stuff. And of course, there are always these ethical concerns if you want to push that a little bit further. But I want to kind of avoid that for this afternoon's thing, because we've heard enough about that for the last week or so. But in terms of the methodological piece now, before I pick up on our research, what's changing between the researched and the researcher is this kind of balance of long-term knowledge with providing service. So the idea of just knowledge creators, of course, that's the excitement about being professors. That's the excitement about being in a world-class university. The world of ideas, that's what we do, and that's great. But it has to speak to problems of practice. It has to be practiced there. And we have to design and refine research questions in such ways that we're moving toward improvement, not just the constant question finding. Because you can always come up with questions. You can always come up with critique. But how about us coming up with some improvement strategies? Understand how to speak and write and present to audiences of practitioners. Finding a voice and a vocabulary that's accessible, that is invitational, that people not only welcome but understand, and not using it to obfuscate what we know. And using descriptive data to reveal practices and outcomes in useful ways, and consider the interconnectedness of classrooms and schools and districts and universities and communities, and what does that look like? So I would argue that our research needs to move in that way and break out of some of the traditional methodological boxes, you know, with people coming and saying, I'm going to do a quantitative study. I said, well, that's very interesting. Do you have a question yet? No, but I'm going to do a quantitative study. I said, that's a very curious thing. So I've spent the greater part of my career here in some of my research classes actually building uncertainty into my students. They come with a real clear thought that they want to do statistics, and I say, oh, well, let's work on that. And then kind of push them. Now, nothing the matter with statistics. Kind of love those numbers. But the thing is, you know, isn't it more important that we say, what are the salient questions? And then we'll worry about kind of the buggy that's going to pull us along. Well, so we had 3 boxes: the leadership box, the learning box, and then we had the methodological boxes. And so what we want to do now is I want to explore our research. And when I say our, I mean with my colleague Carolyn Kelly and actually Chris Hipp, who's at Cardinal Stritch, was involved in that project. And it was a project that was attached to an earlier Wallace Leadership project. But this particular one focused on an aligned system of leadership development, and particularly in 5 urban centers in Wisconsin. And then in particular, focused around how can we enhance practices and build capacity to meet the needs of all students, in particular those who've been traditionally marginalized or underserved. Okay? So that took us into these 5 urban centers and into these high schools, generally about 1,800 to 2,000. I remember one of our participants in the project said, you know, one of the things that's so difficult about leadership in urban high schools is that if you look at the state of Wisconsin, our urban high schools are bigger than a lot of the municipalities that we have mayors for, and we have city council for, and all those kinds of things. And yet we expect this kind of singular view, this leadership, and you know, let's get the right leader or fire the wrong leader, something like that, as if it's so simple to do that. It's very complex work. And clearly our work in these settings demonstrated that. Well, you know, one of the things, I'm sure you know this, you go on Google Images and you can pick up anything here. And this is one of my favorite images. You know, sleeping giant. Now, this is not my language. This is Katzenmeier-Miller. Now, they have a wonderful book called The Sleeping Giant. And it is about how does one tap into that incredible pool, that resource of energy, of expertise, of knowledge, of purpose. And the way they do it is you awaken that sleeping giant, and in this case, that sleeping giant are the people who are already in our urban high schools. There's an extraordinary pool of talent there. And so what our project was interested in doing is, okay, if they're already there, you know, why aren't they more interested in doing it? Or how could they become more involved in it? And how could we reconfigure this notion of leadership from the principal simply can't do it if they've got 225 to 250 teachers? I mean, what did we learn? I mean, I did my graduate program here in educational administration. I know all about span of control. And I know 1 to 250 is not very good. I know that because of Professor Fruth and Professor Bowles, and I know that. They told me that, and I read that stuff. And actually, I believe it, and I've experienced that. So the point is, how can we then, given what we have in the nature and the structure of organizations, tap into those particular resources? I mentioned before that my co-investigator is Carolyn Kelly. What a joy, but we also had Hans Klar and Jason Salisbury, who worked with us over the 2 years of this particular project. And we continue to work on it in terms of our own writing and taking those data. And what I want to talk about, though, is a slice that I'm particularly interested in. You heard Julie mention my own interest, and that's in professional development and organizational learning. So what I want to talk about are 2 research questions that I focused on as we were going through this project. The first of those is, what is the content of professional development, knowledge and skills for building distributed instructional leadership capacity in urban high schools? So what is it that people have to know? What's the content? So if you think about professional learning as being the design, the delivery, the context, the content, and the outcomes, I was particularly interested in, so what is this content? What is it that people who now call themselves department chairs or unit leaders or whatever they might be called that we're trying to tap into, what is it they would have to learn to become part of a cohesive, coherent, purposeful instructional leadership team, or in our case we call it distributed instructional leadership team? So what's the content? What gets them there? How does that happen? And then the second part is, what do the professional development experiences of the leadership teams in these 6 urban high schools tell us about professional development as a major approach for building distributed instructional leadership? So there are many ways that we can enhance organizational capacity. All right? Professional development happens to be one of them. But we have evaluation systems. We have incentive systems. We have selection and hiring systems and recruitment systems. All of those are ways to enhance the quality of the personnel. But I'm just going to focus on professional learning and development for the people who are there. The first thing that happened to us in this intervention project is we went in with, I think, a very noble thought coming from the university. That is, public high schools and urban schools are used to people coming down from the mountain with tablets and saying, here is what you need to do, or here's the solution, or here's the model or template. So we kind of stood back and we said, we're here because we want to enhance leadership in the school, and particularly we want to focus on student learning and helping all be successful, in particular those who are traditionally marginalized, and we're calling it instructional leadership capacity and all that kind of stuff. Well, you remember that thing I said earlier about the language and accessibility and all that kind of stuff? Hands were going up in these meetings. What do you mean? What is instructional leadership? Now, if it's a little vague in our own field, by the way it is, there are people who define it in all sorts of ways. You can imagine that people who've not been kind of just doused in this literature are thinking, what is it you mean? So we thought, okay, that's a fair question. What is it we mean? Now, we were trying to avoid this prescriptive template that everybody had to do the same thing. But in doing so, we created confusion. And so part of this, remember, this interactive part was, oh, hey, we're learning along the way too. And so what we did is we went back and we worked on a definition. So when we went back the next time, we said, well, you asked us, we went back to the literature, we talked to practitioners, and here's what we're coming up with. That instructional leaders create coherent, purposeful, and sustainable learning environments for all students and staff. That's what we mean. And of course, we knew what their follow-up question is. That's just a bunch of words. What is it we're going to be doing now? And we said, yep, fair enough. We're going to be facilitating the development of a shared vision, both at the department level and at the school level. We're going to learn how to use data to set goals and assess organizational effectiveness. We're going to support student and staff learning. We're going to monitor progress, and we're going to promote continuous improvement. These are the tasks that we want you to focus on, that we're going to be calling instructional leadership, that are going to contribute to school improvement, instructional improvement in classrooms, and to desired school outcomes. So that's what we had for our base as we move forward. Now, I said that we had a variety of things that we did in this intervention project. I'm focusing in particular now on the professional development aspect of it. And so we did all-day retreats. We did half-day workshops. We sat in on department meetings. We helped plan with the facilitators for the grant and the principal and the associate principals, kinds of things that they would do. We had evening dinners. We had data analysis. We did all sorts of particular learning venues. And what occurred along the way is, again, the question was, so what's the content? So one of the very first things that happened, it came along this notion of ethical knowledge. And if we know anything about the change literature, we know that people resist change in organizations, especially large-scale change, when they don't understand why things are happening. Why would we do this? And so our participants in these instructional leadership teams, remembering they're now their typical department chairs, their unit leaders, sometimes grant coordinators, and using data and using an enormous array of descriptive narratives, we began answering this question of why this was important. I mentioned the urgency, magnitude, and complexity of the work, and about the failure rate. We can do all of that. But we talked about the role of this public high school, the urban high school, in a democratic society and what its contributions were. The moral commitment to the success of all students, where heretofore we might have been able to think about not all students being successful. And awareness of these achievement gaps. Now, one of the things that surprised us as scholars and as interventionists in terms of this was people can be in these organizations for decades and actually not know enough about their organizations. So when they began laying out data, there was always a sense of surprise. Like, really? That's happening here? That's the change that's occurred? And so it was an aha moment. But it was also a way of getting people then to not only think about the change, but their own personal responsibility in what was occurring. And then again, about the urgency of challenges. Now we're in high schools, and so you can say, well, you know, this change after this usually takes 5 to 7 years for this major change. Crap, if that's your kid, you don't want that to happen. That's a research term we use here at UW. They don't use that everywhere. But the idea that we have these challenges of dropouts and attendance and achievement gaps and post-secondary outcomes, all of that, there's an urgency to that. And we need to get on it. We need to get on it now. And here's what we intend to do about it. So getting people that sense of moral obligation, purpose, and commitment, and building a stock of ethical knowledge was critical to this, and data had a lot to do with that. But they had to know other things. So they had to know ethical content, but they had to know some things. And we can call that propositional knowledge, knowing what. So what is it we're supposed to know? Now, I laid out those 5 tasks already, but instructional leadership, major tasks, okay? Got that. Research. They wanted to know about, so what is it that other schools have done? What about change theory? What do we know about professional learning communities and team building and school improvement and high-performing high schools? So we wanted to know those things. It's not like you can just be, the most passionate person in the world. They had to know things from the research and from experience and from other practice and build that into their repertoire. They wanted a theory of action. So how's this going to work? Trying to lay out, connecting for them. Okay, we're going to do this, and that contributes to this, and that contributes to this, and our outcomes are centered over here. And lastly, the self-knowledge of strengths, skills, and learning needs. They had to learn about, well, how do I learn about myself? Learning to learn about myself. Where are my gaps? Where are my blind spots? And so there's a whole array, if you will, in this content about the propositional knowledge. Amazingly, to me at least, these are professionals who, when they began thinking about themselves as leaders, first of all, didn't even like the title of leader, being called distributed instructional leaders. Because you see, if you're part of a teaching staff in an urban high school, the idea that someone would call you leader makes you the other. And there's a great protection, you see, in 220 teachers around you. They realize the principals and the associate principals, they don't have much protection. They're out there, they got targets on their back, right? From a lot of people. And so that made them uncomfortable just to even be called leaders. It raised questions of legitimacy. Can I really call myself a leader? Because that makes people think that I'm better than they are, that I'm something different or higher than them. So this kind of egalitarian ethic that's deeply embedded in the teacher was a hard thing to get over. But once they got through that, and they could accept the legitimacy of that, then they wanted to know how to do things. Now, one of the surprising things is that they're used to dealing with school-age children, in this case, young adults. But when they had to start turning their focus on their colleagues and say, let's talk about what we're going to do in terms of instructional practices in classrooms to change the opportunities and the successes and the achievement and the development of these young people, they were very nervous about that. And they wanted to say, well, how actually do you set up a meeting? How do you deal with disruptive behavior? How do you plan an agenda? Now, it sounds like I'm being terribly demeaning, and I'm not at all. It's just that they weren't used to these particular tasks. They just assumed someone would do that for them. So they said, well, can you help us with a lot of this process knowledge of how do we do these things? And I remember sitting in on one high school department meeting after a long day at school and then a dinner and all that kind of stuff. And, it was an amazing thing to me, talking about the role of the researcher, to sit there and listen to the teachers absolutely browbeat and abuse the department chairperson, swearing at this person. One person got up and said, I can't stand you people anymore, stomped out of the meeting. I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, wait a minute, there's some ways to deal with this, but I'm going to sit and listen for a while. But they needed to learn a great deal in the content of process knowledge. And so learning how to do these things, how do we do it, setting priorities, monitoring progress, creating action plans, all of that was how-to knowledge, propositional. And lastly, they need what I call pragmatic knowledge, when to do it. Now, it's okay to think about, well, here's what we're going to do. Let's do it now. But sometimes you have to say, time out, time out. Things have happened. People are tired. Or we need to take just one step back. Let's collect ourselves, and then we'll move forward again. And so learning that sense of timing, if you will, for enacting professional knowledge. So they had the ethical, moral commitment. They had the propositional knowledge to move forward. They even had some of the procedural skills and knowledge to move forward. But they had to be very sensitive where are people in this major change effort? Remember, you've been working with us for 2 years. They haven't had that opportunity yet. And this often happens in organizations when leaders come. You know, have you ever been in an organization where someone like the dean goes off to a great professional conference and comes back with an idea and wants to implement it immediately? Or a principal, I didn't mean to pick out Julie in particular, but the idea is that you've been thinking it about a long time. You've been working with it and massaging it, and all of a sudden you want to implement it and you want to go. We say, because urgent, it's demanding and challenging. We need to do it. But you need to let people catch up, of course. And so this kind of creating a readiness for change and a readiness for learning and learning how to learn and dealing with the sense of loss and renewal simultaneously. Because we're going to give some things up, right? We're going to let them go. And we got to talk about that, and it's a very important process. Just letting go, okay? Being able to say goodbye to certain kinds of things. And so we're asking people to change instructional practices, to change norms, to focus on things, and all of that takes a matter of timing. Well, so what are the implications from this research? And about these boxes, leadership box, learning box, methodological box. Well, I guess I would highlight these 4 pieces. That professional development to build distributed instructional leadership capacity is indeed a viable strategy. And it's one of the levers, not the only one, but it's one of the key levers to move these particular organizations, urban high schools, and the concept of leadership, the methodology, how we worked as university folks with people in these high schools, and to move the organizations forward. I highlighted the 4 kinds of knowledge: ethical, propositional, procedural, or process knowledge, and lastly, pragmatic knowledge. So these, as we think about designing and delivering, we have to think about the content, and those are the ones that I would identify. We know about change theory and resistance. We know why people resist in organizations, because they don't understand why they need to do what they want to do. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it, and they don't know how it's going to end up with the consequences of it all. So part of this change process, part of the content, is laying that out. Now, it might seem as though I have, been working for 30-some years now in helping develop and train and prepare people to become school principals. I think they're just really critical folks in our organization. None of what I said diminishes the importance of that leadership. These schools all had very strong principal leaders, and they needed that leadership in order to be able to build distributed instructional leadership. This isn't taking away. This is augmenting and enhancing. And lastly, one of the things we learned along the way was how these organizations manage distractions. Now, there have been some big distractions in the state of Wisconsin this past year. But even before that, I mean, the whole idea that these teams needed more time to work together. These professional learning communities needed collaboration time. So building that systemically in to the system. So what happened in the first year? Well, in one of our districts, it seemed that they were reliant on the Metro bus system, because most of the high school students took the Metro buses, and that wasn't resolved. And so the Metro bus system held it up. Now, most of us don't start, and God bless my preparation program and all the studying I've done in education leadership, but most of them never talk about the Metro bus system and how important that is to leadership and to school improvement and to what we're going to do. And so they learned how to manage such distractions. There were a couple other distractions, too. In 2 of the high schools, the principals left. And this was a major initiative. These are urban high schools. And things happen like this. And there was some turnover in the department chairs, too. So to borrow, Jim Collins' thing, sometimes you need to get the right people on the bus. And a few people were in the wrong seats. In fact, they were in the wrong vehicle completely. And in most cases, they self-identified. And I remember one of our participants saying, you know what? I believe in what's going on. I believe in what you're talking about in distributed instructional leadership. I believe there's a moral imperative to do this. But she also said, I don't have the energy to do it. I'm just going to step aside. Now, that's a courageous thing to say for anybody in an organization. That they believe in it, and she will support it. But she didn't have enough energy and passion to continue along that line. So, I would ask you to follow the metaphor that I've tried to create here and reimagine the leadership space, if you will, for a moment, in terms of leadership, in terms of that singular versus the distributed and collective leadership, collaborative leadership, in terms of the learning and the learner and the learned box, of what that means and what the mindsets of our candidates are. And then lastly, the methodological boxes that we often find ourselves trapped in. And say, let's just push for the question. Let's push for what is most important. What are the critical ideas here? The methods will come. They will come. We'll get there. So my message to you, let's go out and break up some boxes, folks. Thank you. We have about 2 minutes. That's the way I always plan it. And if you have any really difficult questions, please ask Carolyn Kelly, my co-investigator. But we're actually going to finish at 5:02 because we need a transition time, okay, for the next lecture. So comment or question or anything is fine. Or if you need a cookie break, that's good too.
You mentioned the issues around dropout problems in urban high schools, for example. I mean, did any of this, was there an understatement about or under the table kind of agenda about we need to distribute leadership, we need to improve instruction for a specific outcome, a common goal, a common purpose, and that's what's going to be critical to us around instructional leadership and a new school environment, a new school learning opportunity?
Yes, and it's not something other than instructional leadership. What we did is, in the definition, you remember the first bullet point was a shared vision which specified particular outcomes along that particular line that you're thinking. That is the graduation rate. And changing the reality of that. And having our classes be as diverse as the student population. Because we went into some of these urban high schools, and guess what? The classes were really already segregated by socioeconomic class, by race, by all sorts of things. Right? And so those goals were put right up front. Yes, yeah, and very specifically. They wanted them as part of that shared vision. Not some airy-fairy kind of abstraction. But what is it exactly we're trying to do? Because that's where the data, point 2, comes in. So how can we measure this? How do we know we're making improvement? Or that we need to kind of shift gears here? Okay. Yes, Chris?
Paul, when you started working with the leadership team in the building.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that when you use the word leadership, the other teachers in the school see a separation.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at that initial group, to what extent over the years you and Carolyn have been developing, the professional development with them, to what degree have you seen the others come along? Be more open to either expanding the team or maybe taking the place of team members and have it penetrate.
Yeah. In direct answer to that question, we have seen growth. And in fact, we used a survey which looked at the individual, what's happening to you, what's happening to the group and the team, and what's happening at the school level. And in those indicators, what our participants are indicating is that, they're beginning to understand that, so that it's not so fearsome that someone is called a leader, and they get it. The other thing that I think our department chairs learned, and this came out of an evening meeting, and it was extraordinary. This chair, who'd been there for about 20 years, she said, I'm not telling you that what you've been doing for 20 years is wrong. I'm just saying that we need to change because the outcomes that we all want, we're not achieving. So this isn't a blame game. This isn't, you shouldn't be doing that, you need to change. It says, we need to change our thinking. And she said, I know you're working on it. So part of it was gaining that trust. And of course, remember, the wonderful thing about working with department chairs as these transformational instructional leaders is they've got a foot in leadership already because they're part of these leadership teams. But more important than that, they have more credibility because they continue to teach. That's their real work in classrooms. So they're not asking people to do things that they don't do or they wouldn't have to do. So when they focused on enhanced instructional practices, that gave them the credibility they needed. Thank you.